I'm sure we'll have a few more coming to join us as lunch wraps up. I'm Kathy Masterson, Manager of Cultural Affairs here at Windsor, and it is my extreme pleasure to introduce this panel to you. We've been working very closely together over the last 18 months and are moving our project closer and closer to the finish line. And just, before introducing everybody, I want to say this is a phenomenal team that you have here on the tape, up here on this stage, ready to share a really amazing project with you. And certainly if you have any questions or throughout the conference, please don't hesitate to ask any of our staff about this project, because really it's been such an awesome experience. We would be happy to share it with you. So we have five presenters here today. Sorry, I'm bad at math. Madelyn is sitting second from the end, and she is the curator of Museum Windsor. She has been working with the museum for a number of years and has an amazing talent at bringing together really phenomenal exhibits and building a great team of academic and community partners moving subject matter forward, and she'll be sharing her experiences. At this end of the table, we have Colleen Middaugh. She's the project administrator at the City of Windsor. She is with the engineering department and has a background in civil engineering. We keep kidding Colleen because we're the funnest project she has on the go right now. She's got a really heavy workload, but she's really made this project painlessly easy for us by keeping everybody on track and focused. Down at the far end is Doron Meinhard. He is the associate with, I can never say it right, Hariri, Pontarini, he can say it, HPA. He has done some really fabulous projects around the world, so we're quite excited that he's working here in Windsor. One of the more interesting projects that he's working on right now is a Baha'i temple in South America. He has worked on the Western Learning Center at the AGO. And really, he has been very fabulous at taking our ideas and reusing them, fixing them, massaging them into an amazing adaptive reuse of space. James is in the middle. He is the exhibit designer that's working on this project. He has a very open mind and lots of enthusiasm and amazing ideas that are really off the wall and really make you think and consider the subject matter and how it all comes and blends together. And then lastly, the second from this end, we have Yvonne Tang. She is the Director of Exhibitions and Events at Lord Cultural Resources, and she has a background in visual arts and design, which clearly comes through in all of the work that she does. She has led many planning, design, and installation projects right around the world, and it's a blessing to have her joining our team. So on that note, I'd like everyone to welcome the team, and they're going to share with you the intersection and expansion of Museum Windsor.
Working at this museum since 1992. When I started, we're located in a very small historic house, very significant, but very small. If we go to the next slide, I'll give you an idea of what I was dealing with. This is the François Baby House. It was originally built in 1812 and turned into a museum called the Hiram Walker Historical Museum in 1958. And basically acted as a community history museum since then. But about 3 years after they opened in 1958, I found out from reading the records that the curator had figured out already that the place was too small for what it was supposed to do. But then he spent the remainder of his 30 years of his career fighting to get an expansion. One of the secretaries who worked at the time said, "I'm going to be dead before there's a new museum." However, during that time period, we've done at least 8 studies and each of them concluded that we needed a larger space. It goes back to about 1984, and I'm not going to name all these studies because it's kind of boring, but we got to the point where the city took over the museum, and I should actually backtrack a bit to say the museum for the first 50 years of existence was run by the Windsor Public Library Board. And it did a good job keeping us chugging along, but its priorities were libraries, not museums. The city took us over in 2008, and immediately there's a big change in kind of the atmosphere. I do say I had a lot more paperwork to complete, but the flip side of that is that there was a lot more enthusiasm for actually expanding the museum. And there was a municipal cultural master plan in May of 2010, and on that master plan was to undertake a feasibility study regarding a new museum. And so we'd also found out from the federal government that if we wanted federal money, we needed to have a feasibility study. So the stars were starting to align. So we retained Lord Cultural Resources in, I think it was 2011, to complete the museum feasibility study. And over several months in 2011 and 2012, the Lord team reviewed and analyzed background materials provided by the city, plus collected additional data. They facilitated a visioning exercise with city officials and museum staff to discuss ideas and options, as well as fixed and variable assumptions. There were 2 open houses to solicit community and stakeholder input for inclusion in the study. The end result of this feasibility study was that they had recommended the location of the 401 Riverside Drive West site, which is currently the home of the Art Gallery of Windsor. It's about a 15-year-old building. The art gallery was having some financial difficulty and entered into negotiations with the city. The city purchased the art gallery building with the understanding that the first floor would go to a tenant of their choice. Well, as it turns out, we ended up being the tenant of their choice, which was very exciting because the art gallery building is just down the street from the François Baby House. So the city we ended up getting a cultural spaces grant from the federal government. We also were lucky enough to get some money from the estate of a man named Joseph Chimchuk, who had donated about $1 million to the City of Windsor back in 1991 for the purposes of a museum, library, and archives. That would be a whole lecture in itself about how we ended up getting the money finally, but I was really happy when it finally came to our project. And the city funded the remainder of our around $6 million project. So in May of 2014, Hariri Pontarini Architects and their subconsultant Lord Cultural Resources were retained to complete the architectural design and provide exhibition planning services for the museum expansion project. I'll just show you a couple other pre-project slides of the François Baby House. Okay, so we had basically the upstairs gallery was a multi-purpose space that was our second temporary exhibition space. Also, if we had to gather people together for meetings or school groups, and also museum volunteer activities. So everything kind of happened upstairs. Downstairs, the East Gallery was our former permanent exhibition. It was 450 square feet to tell the entire history of Windsor. I'm happy to say we now have many, many, many more square feet to do the same thing. Next. And this is just a bit of a look at our storage area. We have about 2,500 square feet underground at the Baby House, and it was put in the late 1960s, which was the last time we had a significant expansion of the museum. The underground storage actually works really well. It's a wonderful facility, but it's very, very, very full, like many other museums, I'm sure. So we were happy in the new location. We were actually going to get a couple extra little bits of storage. Is it enough storage forever and ever? Of course not, because I like to collect things too much. But it should do us for a while. One more. What you're looking at here is our hands-on history room, which is basically our children's gallery. It was in the basement. You can see a historic fireplace in the corner. Easily one of the most used rooms in the museum. So we knew that one of the things we wanted moving forward was another space, a larger space to deal with, children's hands-on activities. So I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our process and what we put forward in the RFP. It's a little bit simplified obviously for sake of this presentation. But as Madelyn mentioned, the project was awarded to our team in May 2014. And so we had a startup meeting a short week later. And in those startup meetings, really, we looked at the site. We also established communication, how we would all work together as a team, because it's such an integrated group, even just the examples of the people up here today. And really protocols and process and how we would establish working together for the rest of the project. Really, this is also how the three portions of this presentation will be broken up. So there's the project vision, which is how we like to start the project with everybody at the table. And then through that is a two-phase process, so they're sort of above each other in a group, so architectural services and engineering, and then exhibition design and content. And those two processes happen sort of simultaneously and together, and so that's why the diagram is framed that way. And then of course project management throughout, which will be the last couple slides that we talk about today. One other thing, we want to encourage just questions. We want this to be quite a casual and dynamic conversation, so even though we're sitting way up here, please feel free to raise your hands and ask us questions throughout the presentation, or even at the end. We'll have a block of time. So as I mentioned earlier, with the project vision, which is the first step, there was the startup meeting and the site visit, which we did at the end of May. Directly following that, in the beginning of June, was a creative workshop. And really, for that to happen, we like to have all team members in attendance. So it was the museum staff, city, architects, designers, and planners all together in one room. And the reason that we like to do that is because to really have a vision and really to start a project off, it refines the ideas, you have productive discussions and activities, and there's a consensus to the discussions that we do that day, and that forms the rest of our process. And the great thing about this project is when we first started, there was some thematic ideas that were provided by the museum. And so we looked at those all together and refined an organization, which I'll show you in the next slide, on how we thought that could be organized throughout the museum space. And for those of you that came yesterday, you may sort of see some of those elements and how they've started to show in the installation process. So we discussed high-level concepts. We even talk about exhibit ideas. So at that phase, we talk a lot about comfort level in terms of how much content do you want to show, how much of your collection do you want out there, how comfortable are you with media or not having media, hands-on and not hands-on. And so it's really an active discussion. And the decision at that meeting was to show a lot of artifacts, but also to have a lot of fun and really dig into what Windsor is about. So this is the thematic diagram I was speaking of. It is the findings from the workshop, and really it's not, I'm not at design yet, so really it's intellectual organization. How do we think visitors will understand the space? How will they understand all the themes and the stories that we want to tell? And they're really, really high level. These concept and exhibit ideas were tested in public meetings, in focus groups with the French and Aboriginal communities. There was also input from the steering committee, so another unique element of this project was that councillors were involved. And so throughout there was workshops, meetings, and approval processes with them. This was all incorporated into our reports and our designs, so their input from not just the councillors that I just mentioned, but also the French community and the Aboriginal community were incorporated. At this point, we also had started some integration with the base building and the architecture, which Doron will talk about now. This way.
Hi. We were really quite lucky to fall onto this project somewhat by accident. We had come to Windsor a couple years earlier to start another project, and then we picked up another project at the University of Windsor. And when this project came along, we saw that it was an interesting site. We had fallen in love with the river in our couple years here, and we knew Lord Cultural Resources from a lot of previous projects that we'd worked on together. So we decided to attempt this project, and luckily we were successful. This was one of our early sketches for the project here. We sort of envisioned, you know, the Art Gallery of Windsor is quite a large building, quite formidable, but a little bit, lacked a little bit of warmth. And the first time we visited Madelyn's community museum at the Baby House, I saw just the ground floor and the second floor and was quite worried that how would she have enough, how would the museum have enough artifacts to bring into this vast space that we were taking over in the ground floor of the Art Gallery of Windsor. But then, luckily, as she said before, she showed us the basement and the archives and all the storage, so we were relieved to understand that it would be well filled and would be a warm place. So really, I think a few questions arose for us, but we saw this both as a demolition project. We had a lot of demolition work to do inside the building, not too much to build inside the building, and ideally a way to warm up the entrance to the building as well and warm up some of the materials inside. Next slide. So, of course, like most architects, we don't listen to our clients very well in the beginning, and even though they kept telling us that the project was really just the inside, that's all the city had approval for, we kept dreaming a little bit about the outside, which hopefully will come in a later phase. I won't say more about it, but other than this was a very modest vision for an arbor and some greenery on the outside to warm up the entrance, which will hopefully happen in the future. Next. We did some model studies just to try to understand that as well. Next slide. Really here, you know, the existing condition, this slide is a little deceiving and possibly a bit blurred, but what we had when I visited the Art Gallery of Windsor the first time, the ground floor was a very odd configuration because there's basically 4 front of house rooms. The 4th one's missing a wall on this diagram, but there's the top right, the bottom left, there's the big kind of boat concourse in the middle, and then a room at the top right over there, and one other over here. And those 4 rooms were all kind of dark rooms in the Art Gallery of Windsor, and then the concourse was light filled, and they were all quite underutilized. So what we had to try to do for the museum is try to understand how we would create a flow using space that is traditionally not well suited for a museum space, because the concourse is flooded with light. But we didn't want to segregate all the different rooms on the ground floor from the concourse. We wanted really everything to flow and work together and be able to enjoy bits of the view and bits of the river while still maintaining the preciousness and the preservation that the museum team had to maintain for the artifacts. Next. Another of the design challenges was really how to create a unified, I'll just read this here, yet separate entrance for 2 institutions. So this was something that the city was very conscious of. There's another institution in the building, is the Art Gallery of Windsor. They built the building, they owned the building for a long time, they traditionally occupied the whole thing. They are now moving up to the 2nd and 3rd floor, and the Community Museum, Windsor Museum, was coming into the ground floor. So how would both institutions exist together in a collaborative fashion? And so we had workshops with both teams, and we tried to understand how this was going to work. Next slide. So obviously, both institutions have different hours, different schedules, sometimes combined clientele, sometimes different clientele, different functions. How would both institutions enter into the same space? So we developed 3 options for the city. This was our first option over here, where we looked at, traditionally, there are 2 entrances to the concourse of the building, but traditionally, the south entrance was the one favored, and that's where the parking was as well, and that faces the aquatic center. So in this scheme over here, we examined that Museum Windsor would come in on the south here, through the existing entrance, right into basically a concourse gallery, their own reception in a concourse gallery that opened immediately and was joined to the spaces on the west, to those 3 rooms that are now interlinked on the west. Whereas the Art Gallery of Windsor would enter from the north in their own separate entrance, keeping their own hours, and would carve a way through the north portion of the concourse, let's call it, to a refurbished elevator. One of the central aspects of the project infrastructure was to replace the elevator, make a fast and efficient elevator so that people could always get to the 2nd and 3rd floors efficiently. Next slide. The second option here was a little different. We thought that we could create a synergy by having both entrances shared on the south side, where people traditionally associated the entrance of the gallery and museum building of, come in together, create a kind of dynamic hub over at that point, come in, have a joint reception desk for both institutions, and then the museum turns to the left, occupying all the space in the blue and wrapping around the top right there, the blue. And we would hollow out the entire back of house there with a path for the Art Gallery of Windsor patrons to go to an elevator dedicated to the second and third floor. And we were quite excited about this option because we saw this as creating a kind of culture and arts hub all located around this south entrance and this desk of the building here. Next. The third option was we examined was similar to the first option, except the art gallery wasn't at all into the concourse. We hollowed out a new entrance through one of the rooms at the south side directly to the elevator. So this was really the separate tenants kind of scheme. Next. Luckily for us, we were really pushing this option very hard, and I think everybody saw the dynamic energy and the possibilities of it, and so this was the option that we went forward with. And really, the only job we had left to do on the inside of this building was really to put together a solid demolition package, make sure all the infrastructure and the engineering was done properly, get the bones of the space to open up, take down all the walls that close. Go back a slide. Just good. Take down all the walls that separated the concourse from what used to be called, what was the name of that room? This was the
Barbera?
Yeah, that gallery over there. We wanted to create one flowing exhibition, which James is going to talk about later in his presentation. So really, although we usually like to build, for us, a large part of this project was really demolition and the efficient management of that process and opening up the potential of this institution. And then coming in with a light touch at the end and setting up an infrastructure for the exhibition team and the museum team, setting up a palette of some warm materials, something that would resonate well with the public and with the types of things that were on display in the museum. Next slide. Next. I sort of, these slides are a bit dark, but so it's hard to really see here. We could just flip through these really fast. We don't have a lot of great shots. I hope some of you were there last night, but really what we did was, like I said earlier, the challenge was to take the concourse, which is light-filled, and to open that to the two primary spaces on the west side of the building and make one flowing permanent exhibition gallery, and then have a temporary gallery at the northeast corner of the project and the children's gallery at the southeast corner of the project, really cradling this exhibition experience. And you can see here, these are some early shots. This is what the concourse used to look like. It was basically just a vast circulation space. There was a large feature stair there, which we took out, we demolished. Next slide. You can see here, this is how we re-inhabited some of that space. This is a reception desk. So this is that desk I talked about when you came in. Just to the left here, you come in, you have this joint desk, and you turn to the left. We've made a huge opening in that wall over there, opened directly into that concourse space with another huge opening behind it. We took down all the doors, and that opens directly into the permanent exhibition room, which is together one with the concourse exhibition. Next. You can see here the stair being demolished on the right. Next. And this is one of the challenges we had at the north end, all that flowing light over there and what to do with it, how to create an exhibition there. So we worked hard with Madelyn and her team to try to inhabit that. If you go visit the museum, you'll see how that was later inhabited. Unfortunately, I don't have any finished pictures, but James will go through it. Next. And you can see here we opened up the passageway to the children's gallery. Next. It's the transformation of that space. Next. Some before and after shots. This was the old, on the top left here was the old Barbero gallery. So it was one of these closed rooms. It was on the, if you remember the plan, it was kind of on this position here. Let's call it the southwest corner. And it had a big wall built in front of its window, and it was closed to the back to the next space. It was basically a sealed permanent exhibition room. What we did was We took that wall out on the left. We took the back wall out. You can see the exposed beam, and we opened this right up to what used to be called the Tepperman Gallery, the view to the river, and then wraps back around with 2 large openings to the concourse exhibition space to make one flowing space. Next. See here again, similar treatment at the back. We took out the cafe and the restaurant and made that the temporary exhibition room. Next. This is some of the warmth we brought in. We were able to repair and restore a lot of the limestone flooring, but we wanted to introduce a new material. So we used a wide plank hardwood flooring, resonated well with the exhibition design. This is a piece you can see at the back and another piece in the permanent exhibition room. We did large, very large, oversized, 12-foot high, 5-foot wide, pivoting walnut doors, kind of give it a sense of presence and warmth. Next. And of course, the millwork, all simple palette, the walnut, some of the stone that we like to use in some of our projects, Algonquin limestone, natural local materials. Next. And you can see here, this is, okay, this is a bit of a side discussion here. The other thing, another job that came through this project was as the art gallery was moving upstairs to some reduced space, they wanted to be able to display more of their stuff on a permanent or temporary basis in a flexible fashion. So they asked us, they had, on the 3rd floor, they had a large gallery with very large openings in it, very large openings in it that they wanted to be able to inhabit more art within. You can see here what we did. This is one of 4 large pivoting walls. Each one is 11 feet wide by 10 feet high by 2.5 feet deep, and they pivot over a spindle, and they can rotate to be in any position from 0 degrees to 180 degrees, and there's 4 of these, and they can put art on all 4 of them, or they can fold them all in together. You can see the plan of it on the next slide over here. This is on the 3rd floor of the Art Gallery of Windsor. But in conclusion on this subject, I think we were really lucky to have a great team, working with Lord in the past, working with the city. Colleen was an excellent project manager for us. Working with Madelyn and her team was a great pleasure, and we were also lucky to have a very good contractor on board, so the project went very smoothly for what could have been a difficult project, and I think the results are unfolding in the next month, and hopefully everybody will be very satisfied.
So the exhibition design, maybe we could just throw up the next slide, because nobody cares about that. So this is basically, I'm going to have a crick in my neck by the time we're done here. It's just the most awkward thing, having to do this. I remember looking at those diagrams of how do we share this building. What are Doron's thoughts on how to share this building with the art gallery? And as soon as I saw them, I was immediately humping for the option that fortunately won the day, because I think it pushes all the right buttons, and it's worked out very well for us. You know, we were just talking about this at lunch. Museum patrons and art gallery patrons are kind of a different demographic. And so how well were these two going to be good neighbors with each other? It was really important. And I think that this notion that you came in and right off the bat, their sharing facility is pushing all the right buttons and is establishing the right sort of mood, if you will, for the project right away. So I was very excited about that. I don't remember that I actually got to vote, which I'm not sure why that ever was, but there we go. I was very glad that that team won. So we're entering, basically what I wanted to look at here, this is an early concept sketch. This was early days in the project, and we went through several iterations before we kind of landed on where we're at today. The project, just for those of you who perhaps weren't there last night, is half installed, and probably within the next month or so we'll be finished and opening its doors properly. So if you were there this afternoon, you start to get a hint, and you would see things in this plan that are very much of where we're going, but this is not the final plan that we're looking at, just to be clear. That said, we do enter from the south here, and immediately there's a decision point. Do you veer off right to the Children's Gallery, or do you head off left into the rest of the museum space? The Children's Gallery in the Baby House was a cramped, crowded little space down in the basement, and it had its own little charm, but this is a totally different thing now. It's open, it's hugely expanded in space, it's light-filled. There was a shot that went passing by very quickly that showed these brilliant green walls. I'm trying to see, there's nobody here with a green sweater on. you wouldn't wear this color. It's too green. So it's kind of a fantastic space compared to what it was. So the Children's Gallery is one thing in particular that I think we've really been able to elevate from what they were before. You pass through into the concourse exhibition space. I wonder if I can take this out. So you pass through into the concourse exhibition space, but really the plan is to take you right up into the permanent gallery for the most part. We're doing some very broad strokes in the concourse. There's very tall spaces in this museum. The concourse itself is 2 stories high, and in fact it was something that we struggled with, was how to address that extra height that we've got there. I guess in the concourse, well, a lot of what we have is we're letting the big space be the big space. Even though when you pass through into the permanent gallery, it's a very tall space, big boxy space. And so when we get onto some other slides, you'll see that we did make some deliberate efforts to try to engage that space a little bit more, and I think successfully. We'll find out in a month. And that is an addressment, that's not a real word, of the spaces themselves. One thing, there was a shot that went by that showed that all of that, I really need a laser pointer, all of that gallery up at the top is now one continuous permanent gallery space, which in its previous days was 2 spaces. We blew out the wall out of there. That was one of the first notions that Doron had, was let's just plain remove this wall and combine these 2 spaces. And I was right on board with that thinking. We need the extra square footage, and we need to let this space breathe a little bit more. What we found, there's often in projects like this, the process of discovery comes into play. There's a kind of fantastic concrete beam that spans across there. And we were going to clad it up or whatever, but I remember getting an email, I think it was from Doron, saying, we've uncovered this beam. It's beautiful. I mean, it's just concrete, but it's kind of fantastic. What do you say we just leave it? And we said, yeah, I saw a picture, and it's like, yeah, that's fair. We can't cover that up. That thing's fantastic. We'll work it in somehow. And so we did. So there's this, I think what I really wanted to convey about the exhibition design on this project in particular, but on many projects as well, is that you've really got to think on your feet, and you've got to be open-minded enough to just address things as they come along, and you've just got to be kind of working on the fly a little bit. So that was a good example of that. The circulation throughout this space is really what this diagram is all about. We're trying to pull people up. They circulate through the permanent galleries, and then into the top right is a temporary gallery. We're trying to generally encourage people to flow from the permanent into the temporary. But you may notice that halfway along there's some gaps where there's kind of a permeable membrane, if you will, and you can get back into the concourse if you so desired. That's just a big piece of casework. It's not there. You wouldn't have seen it last night. Soon come. And you will be able to sort of flow around this space. So it's not an entirely directed experience through this museum, but it's highly encouraged, let's say. It's an encouraged experience. When you get down to the far end of the concourse is an Aboriginal gallery space down there. And that's where we had some drummers there last night. There was a shot that Doron was pointing at where there was a circular wooden insert in the floor. That was actually, and it was meant as a performance space for exactly that. So that was the first instance of somebody using that for its intended purpose last night. So I was really thrilled to see that. And those guys were cool. From there are permanent gallery spaces up to the top, up to the bottom, and the children's gallery. Aside from that, the Baby House has been repurposed still, and there are two gallery sections in the Baby House itself, 2 blocks away. So there's a constant sort of dialogue up and down the street between the two. Now, one of the difficulties, I don't know if that's quite the right word that I want to use, that we had with this project was that there's a lot of content. Windsor has a long and varied history, and we're expanding vastly from what the Baby House, from what the museum was. This is a huge step for the Windsor Museum. And as such, there's a ton of work for Madelyn and her team to kind of keep up to pace with all of this. So we were designing these galleries without knowing exactly what was going in them. We had an interpretive plan that we were working from, so we knew subject matters. But when it came down to, it's going to be this artifact goes here, or this artifact goes here, or this artifact goes here, we didn't actually know as pen was hitting paper. So that was tricky, but like I said, you got to think on your feet. And so there was a parallel stream of content development happening at the same time that we were doing exhibit design. And the one had to feed into the other, and there's a constant dialogue that was going back and forth. Probably on this project, more so than I've ever worked with in the past. So that was pretty interesting, something to get through. If we go to the next slide. If we go to the next slide, actually Madelyn's going to address that very issue for a moment.
Yes, so having previously only had a $5,000 per year exhibition budget, we'd always done all our exhibits all by ourselves. So this was really a new thing for us, like how do we deal with exhibit designers? How do we deal with, you know, people who are going to take our ideas and do something with it? So we prepared the best we could. We gathered up previous versions of exhibit text. We were always pretty careful about keeping all of that, giving suggestions about what kind of pictures, what kind of artifacts, and we basically sent the whole lot over to Lord Cultural Resources and kind of wondered what was going to come back. And we ended up with an interesting back and forth because they wrote a very draft text, and what we did at that point, because I had no idea what to expect, and what ended up happening was actually quite nice. It was that we had their expertise and they had our content knowledge, and we would go back and forth and back and forth. I think we blew our schedule way out of the water. I mean, text was supposed to be done, I think, probably a year before it actually got finished. But that gave us a chance to not only put in our 2 cents, but also to reach out to our communities. We had content experts in things varying from paleontology to French history to Aboriginal history to Black history, and we were very conscientious about trying to get, you know, expert opinions. Even people who had written local history books, you know, we gave them certain sections to kind of read over, because it's always good to test your material and see what's going to happen, and I'm glad we did because we learned a lot. Of course, the big payback on that, or the big, I guess, payback and problem is that it takes time. So again, our timelines were a little off. But I'm glad we had a chance to do that, because what you end up with is content that really is, you feel like you have a part of, and you feel like your community is actually represented as best you can, because obviously you can never include everybody all the time. When I started this project, I wanted to make sure that we didn't forget about the François Baby House, so what we decided to recommend there was that we focus on French history in one of our galleries and the War of 1812 and the Battle of Windsor in the other gallery, because the Baby House is built by an early French family, and also it's a national historic site and a provincial historic site based on the War of 1812 and the Battle of Windsor, 1838. So now the permanent interpretation in the house actually is important to the house and is representative of it. We're also talking about the Baby family, the history of the house. And the basement, what used to be the hands-on history room, is now going to become open storage, so we can highlight some of our items that don't get out into display very often. We have a fairly large furniture collection, but it hardly ever gets out on display, so we're going to put some of that on material out. And then we can switch it up every now and then and not be so thematically driven, because most of our exhibits have been very thematic in the past. So that covered the Baby House. What I was really thrilled about having all this new space is that our permanent exhibit could go from around 450 square feet to I think around 2,600 square feet. And so we got busy trying to figure out how we're going to fill all the space. Well, it really didn't take too long to fill the space. And we got direction from our steering committee. The city councilors really wanted to see a lot of artifacts. So we made lots of suggestions as to artifacts and pictures, and then we would send in 700 words. We'd get back note, oh, you have to have 300 words. So, and then of course the other interesting thing is that I wanted all the text bilingual, and that was agreed upon by our steering committee. So it kind of cuts down what you can say, so it makes it even a little bit more challenging. Pretty much all the exhibits are French and English. The Aboriginal exhibit will be French, English, and Ojibwa, and in addition we also have some Oneida in there. So we have, it's linguistically quite varied. It does mean that there's probably more text than maybe would be ideal, according to designers. For me, I like text, so that's not a problem. So I think in the end, it was the back and forth and, you know, the respect we each had for each other's expertise and our community experts that really made this project work. I think I'll stop there.
Animated a little bit more from the rather dry plan we looked at before. You can see the concourse space, you can see the combined permanent exhibition space up at the top. The blue space was the temporary gallery I referred to, and then another temporary gallery in the bottom right, and the children's gallery in its rather greenish green in the bottom left. One of the main features that we have in the concourse, in order to address the scale of it, is an enormous map of the Detroit River, which spans right from where you enter the gallery all the way back to the doors that take you into the elevator lobby. And so the thing's got to be, gosh, I should probably know how long it is. It's got to be 60 feet long or more. And so it's at the scale which kind of tries to address the architecture itself. It's a bit of a chronological, going through the permanent gallery, I wanted to talk mostly about the permanent galleries. It's a bit of a chronological approach that we've taken. So the first galleries take us right back to prehistory, and you meander your way through the space following the course of time until you get to that space that used to be a sculpture course in the center, and you're up to contemporary times. So why don't we flip? Oh, I didn't know that shot was going to be there. It caught me by surprise. This is just zoomed in on the permanent gallery itself. Because it became, the interpretive plan called for this chronological approach, it's broken down into about 7, or perhaps it's 8, different little sections. We were very loath to take this tall, open space and chop it up into little rooms and get sort of claustrophobic little rooms. We were really trying to avoid that. We do have a lot of different spaces, but in order to address that, we came up with a notion of sort of permeable screens. So some of the walls, some of the partitions are opaque walls, like you would have anywhere else, and some of them really are these sort of slat walls that allow you to see through into other spaces. Generally, anything running on an east-west, because north is that way, generally anything running on this axis, we've kept as a permanent screen, and things going this way we've got in permanent walls. So that was a device that we hooked on in order to do that. So you sort of meander your way through this space, and I think it's better served by just moving on to the next shot. This is the first thing you come to. I mentioned how tall these spaces were. Right off the bat, we wanted to have a very tall element in the space. Fortunately, there's a sort of geological discussion right off the bat, so we created this very colorful time column, a geological column, which reaches all the way from the floor up to the ceiling in this big sort of candy-colored strip running all the way up there. And it's, it's still in the shop, unfortunately, but I've seen photos of it recently, and it's quite something. So I'm really looking forward to this thing. The first thing you experience when you come into the space is this big, tall thing drawing your eye upward all the way. We benefit from the beautiful new hardwood floor we've got in here. It just elevates the look and feel, and we've tried in the exhibit palette to try to be sort of respectful and respond to some of the architectural palette that's happening on as well. So a lot of these screens I was referring to, for instance, are wood slat screens talking to the floor. We can see through these space right into the next one. There's some sort of hanging banners, and we go into a smaller Aboriginal gallery space. Maybe we should move on. Mm-hmm. We get around the corner. Doron had mentioned that there was a large covered up window, which we inherited with the space. We ripped that out, and then we immediately covered it up again, because that's what we do. However, we covered it up in a more permeable way. I think it's a nicer and somewhat more respectful way that we've done that. We're using a lot of artifacts. We're trying to keep out of cases where we can. This is a very deliberate thing, both in terms of the costs involved, but also in kind of hearkening back to the kind of more community, small town museum that the Windsor Museum kind of grew out from. When I first came into the galleries in the Baby House, you could kind of reach in and grab things if you wanted. We don't want people reaching in and grabbing things. That's not generally good practice. But we really made a deliberate and conscious decision that we would have a number of artifacts available, not under vitrines. I rather like that. I don't know if that's contentious or not, but we rather liked that. The other thing I wanted to talk about was process. A lot of the back and forth in the content that Madelyn was referring to and was an ongoing thing while the design was already pretty much in place, what we were able to do digitally. And this is kind of a new thing. It's not that we invented a new piece of software or anything like that, but I've never worked on a project where we introduced into the software itself the artifacts scaled at size, and we were able to do a lot of that artifact placement. Because of the schedules, it was very difficult to get into the storage area, pull them all out, lay them out on a table, figure out what your case configuration should be. It really was not an option for us on this project. Pretty much all of that work happened digitally, and it was very low tech. All of these shots are just SketchUp. We're working with SketchUp in our office a lot these days, and it was a really great learning curve for us in terms of how to make that content versus design discussion work successfully. And I have every intention of working that way in the future and carrying on that way. This is a really good example. This shows 19th century artifacts displayed in the open at the end. They were all sized just from data sheets that we had from Madelyn's team. Can we move on? Oh, there we are. There's another wall, another space where we introduced a second tall thing. There's a component on this discussion which is all about the Underground Railroad, and we've got some other shots on that. One of the things we wanted to introduce was a strong material palette. We're using a lot of very heavy felt in this project, and I'm totally stoked on this. It's big, thick, 3/8 of an inch thick felt panels. It's got a rough texture, and it's got a sound dampening quality. And just aesthetically, the way it works with the wood floor and the rest of the space, I think is going to be kind of fantastic. We built a very tall element in the center of the gallery space to kind of anchor the space, and you can kind of, the design kind of pivots around it. But it's also, and to address the height of the space, but it's very particular to the Underground Railroad story. So here we're looking down on this space. It's very, as I suggested, it's very tall. It's about 16 feet tall, which doesn't sound like much until you're standing beside it and it towers above you. It's very narrow, so that it is trying to speak sort of emotionally to the experience that black slaves undertook in the Underground Railroad, a sense of compression, a sense of maybe a little bit of claustrophobia. It's just a little unnatural feeling. We've anchored it with two things at either end, which we'll come to. One is a tree down at this end, and at the other end is a light installation which emulates or simulates the North Star. The reason for that is we needed those two anchor points, but moss grows on the north side of a tree, and that was one clue for how to head north to Canada, was follow the moss. The other one, of course, is the North Star itself. We went through a whole exercise, and one point I wanted to make here is that I think Madelyn's team were very brave. They've let us do some things, like right from choosing felt. What the heck? What, are you building walls out of felt? Okay, go for it. You don't always get that kind of a feedback. Another thing was this tree. It's a large sculptural element, and it anchors this end of this experience. Because of the fact that this is such a profound story, the Underground Railroad, it just felt wrong to use an artificial tree. It didn't seem respectful. And so we were very insistent that we wanted to put a real tree in here. Well, trees and natural products really shouldn't go in museums. We're kind of breaking rules every time we turn a corner here. But we did anyways, and they were very brave to allow us to do that. Next one. This just shows some of the thinking behind it. We wanted to have this tall element, some sketches, but we knew that if we put the tree in just exactly as is, it might look a little goofy, so we sliced it into pieces and kind of stacked it up like a Greek column that's kind of shifted a little bit, or something like that. That also allowed us to take the pieces and put them into a kiln and kiln dry them. The tree story, very briefly, if we can move along, is we found a tree in a ravine in Toronto, friend of a friend. They were cutting this tree down. So no trees were heard in this purpose that were not going to be cut anyways. We looked at the picture. He phoned us up, and it was very exciting. He phoned us up on his cell phone. I found your tree. We've got it. You got to come and see the tree, man. And so we hopped in the car, and we went, yes, that 20 feet right in the middle there, that's for us. So the tree came down, And dude carved the thing up into pieces for us. And we went, yeah, every 20 inches, please, if you don't mind, sir. And we hauled those away, and they went off to a shop where they were kiln dried in order to do two things, which is to prevent any sense of checking or anything like that, that they're not going to do something weird when they get into the dry atmosphere of the museum, as well as to get rid of any bugs. It was reassembled there on site. There's steel structure through the middle of it. It's all engineered. It's a beautiful thing. And then installed in the museum. And so we end up with this kind of sculptural but real-world tree, which I think is very significant in addressing the seriousness of that subject matter, if you will. This is just another shot running down there. Inside of that space, and then there are several windows into vitrines with small stories and small artifacts, and it dims the light down. It gives this sort of deliberately claustrophobic space, and then there's the hanging light effect with the North Stars at the far end. So through the sense of the material, through the sense of the process and such forth, we were able to kind of wind our way through this design process, which was a little bit different from what we're used to, but it's been very enlightening, and I think it's kind of changed the way we're going to work in the future. So this has been a significant project for us. The Children's Gallery has been a very interesting one. I've not worked on a lot of children's galleries, but again, this notion of the Detroit River was something that was key to us. We wanted to have a water piece in there at one point. Again, kids' water museums. We got scared away, but we got scared away again. Madelyn and no one ever said, no, thou shalt not put water in our museum building, which I was shocked about. We tried it out, but it was the dollars and cents eventually that scared us away from the water. We came up with an alternative, which still has this children's interactive sense. They can sort of drive boats down the river and such forth. But it involves I won't try to explain it to you too much, but there's thousands and thousands of little beads, little plastic beads, which become sandwiched between two layers of acrylic, become the water. And you drive your boat, and because they have little magnets in it, all the beads spill out, and it's going to be actually fantastic. So this notion of it's not a notion, this river notion we were able to maintain just by, again, sort of thinking on the fly and being a little bit innovative about how we approach the water interactive. I miss the water, but let's face it, it would have been a mess. I don't want to forget the Baby House. There are some significant galleries over at the Baby House. One is on the French culture, and again, speaking about thinking on the fly, one is on the military history. So on the left-hand gallery, we have the War of 1812 and the Rebellion of 1837 addressed in this space. And the artifact that really brought to life this sort of think on the fly stuff was Tecumseh's flag. The museum are fortunate to own an original flag from the era, and it's very fragile. And we had it propped up in a case up in the top left. And I think if we go on to the next slide, it's illustrated a little better. It's that one that seems to have a letter 1 on it in the front. However, very briefly, we have a cannon, because I find this fascinating. We have a cannon here. It's not a real cannon, it's a homemade cannon. And at one point I said, well, there's no point having a cannon if it doesn't shoot something. And everybody agreed with me. Like, I can't get over it on this project. Everybody kept saying yes. So it was kind of fantastic. So we have this cannon that's spring-loaded, and you pull back on a big thing, and you go bling, and it shoots a foam ball across the gallery, right at an artifact. So not only are we're shooting cannonballs at artifacts here, and no one has said no. It's kind of amazing, and I think it's going to be fantastic. We saw the prototype in the shop, and it worked very well, and I'm very excited about it. However, back to the flag. The flag was originally going to be basically displayed vertically inside a very large glass display case. And I think the interesting part of the story here is that it was only much later in the process that we were able to get some more information from the conservation people about this to suggest that, in fact, this flag is more fragile than we all thought it was, and it's not going to be able to do that at all. So we ended up having to totally sort of on the fly change the shape. I mean, the project has been awarded at this point. Everything's all costed. people are practically making, they're ready to start, running the table saws the next week. And we were able very quickly to change the display case such that we got the flag sort of folded into place instead inside a low display case. And we put, just one more shot, we put a large reproduction instead up in behind so that you approach the case and you see the large flag, and then you sort of peel up, again, this heavy felt stuff, because it's light sensitive, you kind of peel up and look into the case in order to see the real flag, and you can kind of look down and look up and look down and look up. And in fact, I think it's going to be a much more interesting way to display this really quite significant artifact. But it was that whole notion, the reason I wanted to talk about it was that whole notion of sometimes you've just got to throw your plans out halfway through, even when the project's already been awarded and they're ready to start building. It's time to change your plans, and you've just got to throw your ego away, and you've just got to do what's got to be done. And I thought that was a really good illustration of that. Of course, the whole project wouldn't have run carefully, wouldn't have run if it had not been carefully managed by Colleen, and so I'll pass the microphone over. Oh, she's got it wrong.
So the engineering department was brought into the project back in 2014. So that was shortly after the museum feasibility study that Lord had completed was approved by council. And at that time, we had received confirmation of our funding from the Cultural Spaces Fund. So that really gave us the go-ahead to proceed with the project, which really, so the next step was to retain a consultant and consultant team, which consisted of architects, obviously, an engineering team, and then the exhibit fabricators. So one thing that we traditionally do out of our department on large value projects or high profile projects is established project charters. That is something that's mandated in our department. And so that really what the project charter is, it provides a framework for how the project is governed. So it lays out rules and responsibilities of the project team. It lays out rules for spending. It clearly identifies what our budget is and our limitations for spending within that budget. There are limits for who can approve of certain changes throughout. The project charter establishes that there's an executive committee. So executive committee consists of senior management as well as the working team. We would be the working team here. And then the steering committee, which we've talked a little bit about. So the steering committee actually has 3 counselors on it. So throughout the process, we are consulting with both the executive committee and the steering committee. So early on, we were meeting with that executive committee bi-weekly, and the steering committee monthly, but as the project progressed, we didn't need to meet with them quite as often. So we now, to this day, we still meet with our executive committee monthly and steering committee as required. So really, at those meetings, we're projecting, or we're not projecting, but we're providing the progress updates on where the project's at, so both from a timeline perspective as well as from the budget perspective. So we've talked a lot about timelines here in the content development. Although it was a bit behind, it really didn't affect our overall project timeline, very much anyway. We were originally projecting to be open a little bit sooner than we are now, but it was really the Canadian Cultural Fund that we were concerned with the timeline. That fund provided grant money for non-exhibit related work, so really a lot of the construction work fell within that fund. So we were working towards getting that construction work done by the timeline that we required for the grant. So really just the important thing, I guess, throughout that process was consulting with those committees, consulting even with our teams here. So throughout the construction phase, we met bi-weekly, and we've carried that through with the exhibit fabrication stage. So we're able to make these changes as we've gone along because we're meeting so frequently. So those meetings happen bi-weekly regardless, and we have an agenda where we talk about status, where we are with each item, and our timelines, and of course our budget. So there have been some changes, so that has impacted the budget. We have a contingency that we've been able to work with, and that, again, is reported out to our executive and steering committees. One thing that I wanted to mention too, and I think it worked really well on this project, is we pre-qualified both the contractor. So we had the contract for the architectural and engineering works. That was a separate contract from our exhibit fabrication works. We pre-qualified those contractors and exhibit fabricators to really narrow the pool from what we were selecting from. Our purchasing bylaw requires us to go with a low bid most of the time, well, not most of the time, all of the time. So by pre-qualifying, we were able to narrow the field or narrow the group that we could pick from for the work. I think that's all I had on that one there.
One thing we wanted to put together for this, and I think that we thought was interesting in what we learned on this project working together and that we thought would be helpful for you, is to really look at some of the challenges that we had working on this project. So I'm not going to read off the slide, but those are basically the 5 points. So in terms of small teams, they can be good and bad. So there was challenges when there's a lot of approvals, and sometimes throughout the process there would be design approvals, content approvals, approvals during meetings and things like that that have to happen in a quick time frame. And so there's moments when there's small teams when there's a lot on people's plates. And schedules can help a lot in this regard, and we're trying to plan in terms of deployment and setting aside the time that is required to make sure that all those important approvals are being made in a respectful time and having people comfortable with the decisions that are being made. It's also great, as Colleen mentioned, is that we had a lot of meetings together, and so during that time it was great to have small teams because we're all sitting on meetings together, so then decisions can be made quite quickly, or we could come up with problem solving. So for example, James was talking about the flag case. That was something we discussed in one of our weekly calls. Everyone kind of played off each other in terms of what about this, what about this, what about this, and I think we didn't resolve it in that meeting per se, but subsequent emails probably the day or the day after, and then the designer went away and came up with a solution that we continued to work through. So we were really, I think, maneuverable that way in terms of having a small team able to come up with these solutions and decisions during our meetings. The other thing is schedule and deadlines. So transparency, I think, is really important in terms of deadlines and schedules. They give flexibility and ability to adapt to our changing dates. So because we had these calls, because we were constantly in contact with each other, we knew if things were taking a little bit longer, or we knew if, where we were at with content at all times. And those were things that we talked about at a lot of our regular meetings. One thing to watch out for, though, is sometimes too much time can result in, oh, I don't have to make a decision for 6 months, so no one makes a decision, or design or production gets delayed, and then you have to pay for storage in a facility. So there's goods and bads, and I think just ensuring that you're transparent in terms of notifying your team and notifying everybody involved for these deadlines are really important. Having the multiple stakeholders, and we knew this really early on, that they had all these groups that they needed to consult and talk to, and so we really built that into our process and our schedule, and we knew at what points that it would be important to consult with them, or Madelyn knew when the approval processes were for content, and so all of that could be built into the approval process. Also knowing when to ask for key decisions. So James sort of presented everything in his design in one big chunk. Obviously that's not how it all happened. We had multiple design submissions that happened throughout. So one of the first ones was during interpretive planning. We had some of the some of the concept design done already. And then through the detailed design, schematic design process, then there were subsequent submittals. Coordinating architecture and exhibit design. Ideally, for projects, I think it's good to have time for integration. We had a little bit of time for integration in terms of where, for example, electrical would go, or where we want walls to be built. Although architecture usually begins first, that allows time for the building to be done and the designers to have a framework to build the exhibit design. And then, of course, feedback both ways and having that integration. Even with the grants and the deadlines that we had for that, we were able to talk to each other in terms of making sure that we had things approved and finished prior to that grant expiring in August, and then ensuring that the elements that were in the exhibitions were also integrated. And then finally, one thing that we didn't expect to have, Colleen and I, was invoicing protocols. So something that came up was construction billing is very different from exhibition billing. So there, you know, she was used to a bill of quantities, I think, and you know, this many doors and this many things, and I was like, I don't have that, right? Like, you know, because there's custom cases, custom graphics, and things like that. So understanding that sometimes your invoicing protocols could be different between the different teams, and catching that really early for us was really key, because once then, my next slide, we standardized the paperwork process. And so we did that way before the fabricator had started billing, and we knew how things were going to flow throughout invoicing. And then once we had standard paperwork, it became super easy at the end of every month to put together that paperwork, and we had that standardized. The other thing I think we've tried to talk about between our teams in this presentation today is that clear and open lines of communication were really clear right from the beginning. So from the startup meeting, you know, we knew what to talk to Colleen about, what to talk to Madelyn about, and which members of our team were key to speak to at certain moments. This way, the detailed questions can be directed to people, and then you're CC'd if you don't necessarily need to answer. And I think that smooths things out throughout the process. And then also having an integration, so with our weekly calls, everyone was on the call. And so we would talk through architecture, exhibition design, content, and all those things were discussed together. So we really had a team mentality. I don't think we ever felt like, you're the city, I'm the consultant, and that kind of thing. We all really wanted to push towards a really great product that we're all proud of. And I think the other thing was really, James brought it up a little bit, but using programs effectively. So digital signing was super handy when we were doing some of the approval processes and approving of PDFs and marking them up and sharing them within the team. It was super easy doing things that way. And now we open it up to you if you have any questions for us. Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. We appreciate you sitting and listening to us, and yeah, come visit the museum when it opens, hopefully in a couple months.
As somebody who was born and raised in Windsor but has been away for 20 years, I can't tell you how exciting it is to hear about how this project is coming to fruition. It's long overdue, and you're doing excellent work that's going to have such a wonderful impact on this community. And it was such a privilege last night for those of us who were able to have a sneak peek. So thank you for sharing today with us your processes, your experiences, your challenges, and your learnings on the project. And we wish you well and look forward to hearing how it all rolls out. So congratulations on a job well done. And on behalf of the Local Arrangements Committee, we have a token of appreciation for each of you. Please join me in thanking our panel today. There's less than half an hour until our next sessions begin.